All right, let's get started. So, do you need approval for that? This micro training is all about whether or not you need board approval for various things. If you're an executive director wondering this question, or if you're a board member wondering whether or not your ED should be seeking approval, these are two sides of the same coin. This is a huge topic for a 15-minute micro training. So we're going to dive in, go fast, and if there's anything that you want more information on, just leave me a comment, send me a note, and I'd be happy to do additional trainings on some of those topics. So here's the short version. There is no right answer unless you stipulated in your bylaws or some other policies or some other board approved plan whether or not something required approval. So we're here for the long answer, right? The long 15-minute answer. So what is it? Why do we even get board approval? What is the purpose of boards anyway? Well, there's a long history about boards and why they came to exist that we won't get into. But when we think about the legal structure of boards, boards are really there as a balancing means of balancing, making sure that the organization doesn't take on too much risk. So getting board approval or asking your executive director or CEO to get board approval is really all about managing the amount of acceptable risk in the organization and making sure that nobody has too much power to take risks that are inappropriate for the organization. Now, I'll just tell you, when I started to make this diagram, I wrote risk mitigation in the middle, and I realized that that was wrong because as nonprofits, one of our primary jobs is to be innovators, to create new solutions to very complex problems, or improve existing solutions to very complex problems. And so by our nature, we actually need to be really good at taking risk. And that's something a lot of nonprofits struggle with. So at the core of this challenge is, how do we deal with risk? So we have the board as an actor, the CEO or ED as an actor, and when they come together, we manage our acceptable level at risk. So I'm going to just bring in a few things here that we want to do or that we want to avoid. So when the board mandates that the nonprofit do something, even though the executive director or CEO dissents, says, I don't think that's a good idea, the board is assuming all of the risk. And it may or may not be acceptable, but the weight of the risk lands on the board. And conversely, when the executive director acts, even though the board has said, don't do that, we don't think that's a good idea, then the CEO or executive director is assuming liability for the risk that they're taking. And then in the sweet spots, we have two sides of the same coin. Either the executive director or CEO requests that the organization do something and is seeking board approval, and the board approves it. Then the CEO or executive director and the board are all assuming that risk together. So the liability for taking that risk is distributed, and probably it's an acceptable risk for the organization because everyone was in agreement that it was a good idea. And on the flip side of that coin down here, your board mandates that the organization do something, and the executive director agrees that that is the right direction to take, the right action to take, in which case, again, the executive director, CEO, and the board are sharing liability for that risk together, and chances are you've come across a very acceptable risk. Now we have some gray areas. The board approves a micro, that means small, detailed level plan with all the details already included. This is approaching on micromanaging and basically gives the executive director no room to modify the plan in action without coming back to the board to make sure that the plan actually achieves its primary goals. And so this is a form of micromanaging. And when the board micromanages, the board is assuming most of the risk, but it's definitely a gray area. And similarly, when the executive director acts outside of a board approved plan, that could be the bylaws, that could be policies and procedures, it could be a strategic plan, it could be any sort of plan that the board has approved, then the CEO or executive director is kind of acting outside on their own. So we really want to make sure that we are squarely in the acceptable risk and having the liability for the big things lie on both the shoulders of the executive director and the board, so that we are working together with a shared understanding of what acceptable risk is. So I'm going to go into how do we avoid micro level plans and executive directors acting outside of the plan, because this really comes down to how we make plans. But before we go on, we've all heard, right, that it's bad for boards to micromanage. But I've seen executive directors oftentimes kind of bring on the micromanaging situation by making micro requests. So if you go to your board for one-off approvals, you are setting the stage for micromanagement. It's also a clue for the board and the executive director that you don't have a clear plan of action that everybody's aware of and that the board is okay with you proceeding on. Because if you did, you wouldn't have to go for one-off requests very often, except in like extreme changes that you were unexpected. So rather than going to a one-off request, we want to change the way we do plans so that it's actually clear whether or not the CEO or executive director needs approval, because the plan really outlined where that line of getting approval is. And because as long as we run on one-off approvals as the norm, then we are at risk for micromanaging and dysfunction and confusion around what needs approval. So there's two main types of plans I'm going to give you guidelines on. And the first is budgets. These are money plans. And the second is non-budget, so non-budget plans. So here is my guidelines for how to approve a budget plan. And so what I see so often is people are presenting their budgets in all sorts of detail, and they're supposedly getting that approved. But what does that really mean? What if you want to tweak your payroll expenses a little bit and it doesn't really change anything, or it's not a big deal, or you want to swap, you get a good deal on something, and so one item is coming in lower than you expected, and maybe something to get the quality you need is coming in higher. That is too much detail for your board approved budgetary plan or financial plan. So here are my kind of high level recommendations for when you think about approving your budget. And I want you to think about having detailed sub budgets that your board may become aware of, but then one kind of summary budget, which is the page of your budget that your board is actually approving. And here's the information I recommend you approve. And admittedly, this is different than a lot of people are doing it. But I think if you do this way, you will be thinking about and focused on how much risk are we able to take in, and how is that reflected in our budget. And that is what you really want your board to approve, is they want to agree that the basic idea of the financial plan is a good idea, the high level, the macro idea, and that the amount of risk that everybody has agreed on is the right amount of risk for the organization at that time. So here are the kind of key things that I want you to think about approving when you approve a budget. What is your minimum regular contribution margin? What this number is after all of your income, your regular income, meaning money you count on again and again, not capital campaigns, not big one-off things. All of your income minus your program expenses, minus your direct program labor, and then how much money is left over to pay for those overarching, sometimes they're called overhead expenses, operation expenses. That's what this number is. So that's a great number to think about, is if you want to make sure that you have enough money to cover your anticipated operating expenses, you want to set that as a minimum amount to cover your expenses, so you're not going into debt, unless you've agreed that it's a good year to go into debt for a very specific reason. Set your maximum regular operating expenses. So beyond that point of your general operating expenses, somebody would need approval. Below it, you don't. Swapping things around, no problem. Your minimum LUNA. LUNA stands for liquid unrestricted net assets. Basically, you want to say, what is our minimum threshold for our reserves that we want to have available to us? This is our safety net. Again, we're thinking about approving budgets as far as proving our general plan and our tolerance for risk this year or next year or for any given period of time. And then your profit margin range. This is the net amount of money that's left over at the end of the year. And rather than just saying our budget comes out and that we're balanced, right, that it's a zero amount, I want you to think about 3 ranges that you can set. An unhealthy range that is probably 5% and below of a profit margin as a percentage of total income. So think if that's below, then it's unhealthy and you need to come in and change your financial plan. A mid-range of acceptable or healthy, which means this budget is covered. We're able to put kind of a standard amount away for a rainy day or plan for increased expenses next year due to inflation. And finally, a kind of growing range where you have predetermined that if you're in the growing range, your executive director might come back with a revised budget for some additional spending, or that you have a heavy kind of investment plan that you're going to put money away. And then any critical specifics for that budget. So if your budget, if your financial plan only works because you increased your marketing budget specifically to a certain amount, put that in there. Or if you, let's say you had a goal to add in health insurance for your employees this year, that you want to kind of pin certain line items so that they do not get changed because that's meeting a specific goal, or that's a key thing that makes the plan work, then you can put those in as specifically approved. And if they're going to be different, that they need to, the executive director would need to come back to the board. And then also, or as an alternative, just an acceptable variance range for your large budget categories. So like overall program income, overall program expenses, any kind of major category. Think broad strokes here, and you can just specify when you approve the budget that you're approving that any financial expenditures or income that is less than 20% of what you budgeted for, there is no approval needed, and anything that is over 20% at the macro level, we're not talking about small one-off expenses, would need approval. And at that point, if you're getting significant changes, you might want to present a whole new budget rather than start making one-off approvals. Okay, so let's talk about plans that are not budgets. And in both of these plans, you want to specifically indicate when you motion to approve that budget or when you make a motion to approve some other plan, that any details outside of the macro level plan that you are approving are delegated to the executive director or CEO at their discretion. So executive directors, when you bring a plan to your board, I want you to divide that plan into 2 parts. A summary, high-level macro plan that is the specific thing that your board is going to approve. And then separate from that, all of the details of your plan that will give your board the full picture, but are there details that may change as you start executing the plan? And those are all the details that you're going to be accountable for deciding, and that your board has approved that it's okay for you to make all the decisions within those details. So separate those two things out. Don't confuse your board. Don't say, here's my giant plan with all its detailed, approve it or don't approve it. You want to spoon feed your board, and as a positive thing, give them the specific thing that you're asking for them to approve. Now, they might add in some specific things that they want to ensure are kind of locked in. So similar to the budget, broad strokes, it is a master level macro plan that we want our boards to approve, so that as executive directors, you have the support of the board and the ability to make the changes you need to get the best outcome and the best results possible for the least amount of energy, effort, and money. So key outcomes. What is the key goal for the plan? Everybody should be clear about that. So make sure that's in there. The high level tactics, or your theory about your approach, your theory of change could, if you're using theories of change, that could be in there. Basically, it's either, we are going to try X, Y, and Z things to have the result that we're looking for, but high level. Don't get too specific here, because as you get into the trenches in any plan, you're gonna want to make frequent changes, and that is why it's so great to have an executive director, because the executive director can make the decision and lead the decision making on those final changes. Any critical specifics. So if your plan only works if you get, let's say, 100 participants into this new program you're designing, and less than that, it falls flat because you need 100 to prove that it works, then you can lock a specific thing like that in. And then specifically identify what the acceptable variance is. So that is just like that 20%. It's a little fuzzier in plans, but that you might say that the executive director could change up to 20% of the items, or could change the tactics by 20%. You don't have to use 20%, but decide what kind of that broad range of changes that you're expecting within the normal course of executing that plan, and that you are leaning on the executive director to make those decisions, and specifically saying, if it changes more than this, we'd like you to come back and get approval on a revised version of the plan. So, and then specifically, again, when you approve the plan, specifically delegate the micro details to the executive director. If you are going, oh my God, my organization doesn't think about risk. We're totally dysfunctional. We can't even begin this part. Or how do I even make a plan, or my plan is messed up, or our budget, how do I get from here to there? Please feel free to apply for a free consultation call with me. I'd be happy to go over your situation one-on-one. Just go to pivotground.com/apply, and you can find a spot on my calendar and let me know a little more about what's going on for you, so we can get the most out of our time together.